More allegations emerge of sexual abuse within football. The former Newcastle United player Derek Bell describes abuse he suffered in his youth team in the 1970s.
Horrific. It just, you couldn't imagine every sexual act that you can imagine. He did. It was just horrendous.
And Chelsea Football Club is carrying out an investigation amid reports that it made a payment to a former youth team player who said he'd been sexually assaulted. Also this lunchtime. RBS fails the Bank of England stress test. It's the worst prepared of the UK's big lenders to cope with another financial crisis. Only one of the UK's 13 ambulance services is meeting the target for responding to life-threatening emergencies. Delays at hospitals is one of the reasons.
We're there waiting with patients. We've then got patients waiting for ambulances to arrive, but we can't go to them because we're waiting to sort of hand over our patients.
Brazil begins 3 days of mourning after yesterday's plane crash. Supporters of the footballers who were killed gather at the club's stadium to pay their respects. And raring to go at 89, Joe Bartley says he's bored stiff and is desperate for a job.
In the south, ambulance crews under stress. In some parts of the south, the number of emergency call-outs has tripled in recent years. And there's a human cost. We'll have the story of one patient who waited nearly 4 hours for help.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The former Newcastle United player Derek Bell has become the latest footballer to waive his anonymity and speak out about abuse he suffered when he was in a youth team. He says he was subjected to horrendous sexual abuse at his local boys' football club, Montague and North Fenham, in the late 1970s. His abuser, George Ormond, was found guilty of 12 indecent assaults and was jailed for 6 years in 2002. Several football clubs have now become embroiled in the scandal. Chelsea have announced that they've hired a law firm to carry out an investigation concerning one of the club's employees in the 1970s, who is now dead. Our sports news correspondent Richard Conway reports.
The pain and torment is now hauntingly familiar. Derek Bell played for Newcastle United, but he still lives with the trauma caused by the sexual abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of his coach, George Ormond.
Horrific. It just, you couldn't imagine every sexual act that you can imagine. He did. It was just horrendous. I can't, I lived daily for 42 years. I'm 53 now. For 40 odd years, I've never had a proper night's sleep. I wake up shivering, crying, horrendous, intrusive thoughts that go through my head.
11 police forces are now investigating claims of historical child sex abuse related to football. The national body, which coordinates the response to past child abuse, Operation Hydrant, says it is currently collating cases relating to the game. The latest club to be dragged into the growing scandal is Chelsea. The Daily Telegraph alleged that in the last 3 years, the club paid a former youth team footballer who claimed he was sexually abused by their former chief scout. The club has declined to comment, but in a statement it said a legal firm was investigating an individual employed by them in the 1970s who is now deceased. Meanwhile, the BBC has learned the FA withdrew all funding from a major review of its child protection policies in 2003, some 3 years early. The FA said it could not comment due to an internal review into how it handled sex abuse claims.
All of these build a picture which is not very good for football, which suggests that people did know that there was a problem and they could have and should have done more years ago.
British football's dark history is slowly, painfully revealing itself. How the game responds will be both a measure of its governance and its future moral standing. Richard Conway, BBC News.
RBS, which is part owned by the taxpayer, has failed a test designed to see whether it could cope with another severe global economic slump. The bank failed to meet two key targets and was the worst performer among the UK's 7 major lenders. RBS said it has taken steps to enhance its capital strength, but recognises it needs to do more. Andy Verity reports.
Like a recurring nightmare, the mess created by RBS's directors in their reckless expansion before the crash keeps coming back to haunt us all.
Tonight at 10, it's all change for the British banking system, and the taxpayer foots the massive bill.
Today, 8 years on, the bank still wouldn't have enough capital tucked away if it had to withstand a severe economic shock. The Bank of England tested the biggest banks to see what shape they'd be in if the price of oil slumped to $20 a barrel, the average house price dropped by 31%, and the UK economy shrank by 4.3%. Even in that severe scenario, most banks passed.
The resilience of the system during the past year in part reflects the consistent buildup of capital resources by banks since the global financial crisis. As a result, the UK banking system is well placed to provide credit to households and businesses during periods of severe stress.
Barclays Bank and Standard Chartered didn't have quite the amount of capital the regulators would like as a safety cushion, though the regulators are satisfied they're getting there. But RBS failed the test and will have to find new ways to raise money. Since the global financial crisis, RBS has posted losses adding up to more than £50 billion. That's even more than the £45 billion that the taxpayer spent bailing them out. And now, in order to have enough money set aside, they have to raise another £2 billion.
This is a bank that's been failing for some considerable time. That cultural change has clearly not worked its way through. They've had long enough to change the culture. If this leadership can't do it, then perhaps another leadership should be found at the top of the bank.
But it's household debts as much as bank debts which could destabilise the economy.
With credit available and cheap, consumers are drawing down their savings and borrowing for the first time since the crisis. These developments reinforce existing vulnerabilities from high and rising UK household indebtedness.
After the crash, households cut their debts compared to their incomes, but now, encouraged by cheap personal loans, those debts are climbing again. Households can afford that borrowing if interest rates stay at record lows. Andy Verity, BBC News.
The US President-elect Donald Trump has indicated that he intends to give up his business interests when he enters the White House. In a series of tweets, he said he'd be holding a news conference along with his children in December to discuss leaving what he called his great business in order to focus on running the country. Mr. Trump has been criticised for a potential conflict of interest should he maintain a role in his global businesses while president. A BBC investigation has found that ambulance services are struggling to reach seriously ill patients quickly enough, partly because of long delays in transferring patients from ambulance to hospital. Of the UK's 13 ambulance services, only Wales is currently meeting the target of reaching emergencies in 8 minutes. Freedom of Information requests show that crews are wasting 500,000 hours every year queuing outside hospitals. Our health correspondent Robert Piggott reports.
A Belfast ambulance rushes to a road traffic accident. A car and lorry have collided and a man is injured. But getting to the most urgent calls quickly enough is getting more difficult. Ambulances in Northern Ireland are supposed to reach life-threatening cases within 8 minutes, at least 75% of the time. They manage to do so only about half the time. Another city, another emergency.
Just show me right across your tummy here.
Yeah.
OK.
A 94-year-old woman has suspected sepsis, a dangerous infection. England hasn't met its 8-minute target for 16 months.
You all right?
On the way to hospital, the woman starts to breathe more heavily, a sign her condition is worsening. But she has to wait in the ambulance for almost an hour before A&E can take her.
The hospitals, they don't have the room, they don't have the places to put them. So we're there waiting with patients. We've then got patients waiting for ambulances to arrive, but we can't go to them because we're waiting to sort of hand over our patients.
Across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, ambulance services lost over 500,000 hours last year waiting to hand over patients at hospitals. Hours lost in this way have increased by 52% in the last 2 years. In Scotland, the figures are measured differently. The turnaround times at hospitals has increased by 31% in the last 2 years to nearly 90,000 hours.
Ambulance service, the patient breathing.
Ambulances in the southwest of England had to wait more than 2,700 hours in total outside hospitals last month alone. Call handlers say it hampers their ability to meet response times.
We never used to have calls stuck in, regardless the category of the call, and now, daily basis, we are stacking calls that we haven't got enough resources to go out to the patients.
This is a 111 call.
Demand for ambulances has increased hugely. A service that took 1 million calls 50 years ago now deals with 11 million, although the service itself is only 4 times bigger.
The main problem is increasing demand in the systems. If we look at where we are this year compared to last year, we're up by 658,000 999 calls. That's a 7.3% increase in demand across the ambulance service. And obviously when demand is rising that quickly, it puts a lot of pressure on the system.
That's lovely, thank you.
Wales is pioneering a new procedure due to be introduced in England too, where call handlers spend slightly longer assessing the seriousness of calls before sending ambulances.
Having that extra time to ask those questions makes us then more smarter in the way that we allocate or dispatch the ambulance or RRV or whatever.
An ambulance delivers a patient after another extended wait outside A&E. NHS England has acknowledged that hospital queues are a serious and worsening problem. Robert Piggott, BBC News.
Well, let's talk first to our correspondent Stephen Godden, who's at an ambulance control centre in Edinburgh, and give us a sense of the picture where you are, Stephen.
Well, it's a typically busy day in here, staff handling calls and sending crews out up and down the east coast of Scotland. As far as the pressures on the system in Scotland, they're very similar to those that you've been hearing about. The volume of calls is on the increase, around 1,000 additional calls every month. Staff are having to deal with ambulance crews, are having to wait longer to turn around patients at hospitals. And when it comes to response times, they're getting further away from reaching the targets that they have set for themselves. And that is the backdrop to one of the biggest changes for the Scottish Ambulance Service in more than 40 years, a new clinical response model. So rather than a blanket 8-minute response times for ambulances to reach, they're now prioritising calls, those that will be prioritised and demanding the fastest response, those that are immediately life-threatening, so cardiac arrests or people who've been in car accidents, for example. We are only 1 week into what is a 12-month pilot. Staff say that the early signs that are good, but it will be independently assessed, and if it's successful, it will carry on. Ultimately, though, that will be determined by whether or not it is able to help the staff, the ambulance crews, to save more lives.
Stephen Godden, thank you. And let's talk as well to our health editor, Hugh Pym, who's joined me. And overall, Hugh, what does all of this tell us, really, about the continuing pressures on the NHS?
Well, Jane, it does tell us another aspect, doesn't it, of the stresses and strains right across the system, because ambulances are waiting more than the 15-minute required handover. We heard an increase of more than 50% in 2 years because beds are not free to receive their patients. And that's because actually it's harder for hospitals to discharge patients back into the community, often because of social care problems. So it's a system-wide issue. And one thing that strikes me, having spent a day out with an ambulance service yesterday, is the amount of time that's spent away from hospitals dealing with people in their own community for ambulance crews. Maybe if a GP is not able to get to see an elderly patient or social care hasn't quite worked out, the ambulance crew then has to spend time with that patient and maybe take them to hospital unnecessarily, all of which is time when they could be seeing other patients and getting to other emergencies. And then you have this issue of targets being missed in terms of responsive within 8 minutes. Now, we've heard there in those two reports that in Wales and Scotland they're pushing on with trials to change this, to allow ambulance operators, call handlers to spend a bit more time working out what the urgent cases are. There are also trials in England, which NHS England says are going well. But NHS England does also say that this is a worsening and serious problem in terms of these waits at hospitals. And of course, we've got the winter months still to come.
Hugh, thank you. Hugh Pym. And just to tell you, if you'd like to find out more information about this story, you can find that out and assess how your local service is performing as well. All those details are on our website, bbc.co.uk/news. And there is more about this in the news wherever you are on BBC One coming up after this programme. Brazil has begun 3 days of national mourning as investigators try to find out why a plane carrying one of the country's up-and-coming football teams crashed in Colombia. 71 people were killed, 6 survived. The team's supporters and relatives of the victims have been gathering at the club's stadium to pay their respects. Julia Carneiro reports from there.
The loyal fans of the Chapecoense once more crowding the stands of their beloved football club. It's become a venue for collective mourning. Last week, these fans were thrilled. The Chapecoense had made it to its first international final. Now, people can't believe their players won't be back again.
We've been following the team for ages, since they were in the 3rd, 4th division. And this to happen now that we had a real team. How could God allow this?
The Chapecoense is the city's pride and joy, and now the city has come together to pay tribute to the club. They've gathered here in the club's home, the Condá Stadium, in a moving event to remember all those that were lost in this terrible tragedy. Throughout the day, families of the victims received support at the stadium. The football team had been flying to Colombia for the final of the Copa Sudamericana when the plane crashed close to Medellin. Eliandra Valle's husband was the club's head of security.
He was so happy in Chapecoense. Unfortunately, now all this happiness has been replaced by mourning.
But some only just escaped tragedy. Chapecoense player Alejandro Martinucci was saved by an injury. It kept him out of the final and out of the flight to Colombia.
I have 3 kids. It's hard to think, what if I were there in that plane? And why I wasn't there? It's tough. There's too much in my head right now. Maybe in a few days I'll be able to think about it. It's just very sad.
It will take a long time for these wounds to heal, but as these banners say, the players here will be remembered as eternal champions. Julia Carneiro, BBC News, Chapecó, Santa Catarina.
The time is 17 minutes past 1. Our top story this lunchtime. More allegations emerge of sexual abuse within football. The former Newcastle United player Derek Bell says he suffered abuse at his youth team in the 1970s. Still to come on the programme, Prince Harry is in Barbados to mark the country's 50th anniversary of independence.
In South Today, we'll have your full local weather forecast. Also, the Mannequin Challenge with a serious message about domestic violence from Thames Valley Police. And a mystery in Bicester. What is this building? Discovered on an old RAF base.
The ashes of the late Cuban leader Fidel Castro have begun a 4-day journey across the country today, from the capital, Havana, to the birthplace of the revolution, Santiago de Cuba. Yesterday, several foreign presidents joined hundreds of thousands of Cubans at a memorial in Havana. Fidel Castro's ashes will be interred on Sunday. Barbara Plett-Usher reports now from Havana.
They gathered to say goodbye to the man who has shaped their country and their lives in a square that once echoed with his marathon speeches. Joined by international leaders who shared Fidel Castro's revolutionary history and benefited from his support, leftists from Latin America, African rebels turned presidents.
Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro attracted many enemies and survived hundreds of assassination attempts because of his unapologetic stance against imperialism.
But in death as in life, Fidel Castro divided world governments. Most Western nations sent lower-level delegations, held back by his contentious political and human rights record. His people spoke only of socialist achievements and nationalist pride.
Me particularly, I'm very thankful with him because about him, I could study without paying.
He's a world leader because in every part of the world, Fidel Castro is an image, is an example for everyone.
This is the kind of send-up that Fidel Castro would have relished. Once again, Revolution Square overflowing with people, his old allies here remembering his glory days at the height of his power, and tributes to his brand of revolutionary socialism. The revolutionary slogans didn't hold everyone's attention, though. In many ways, the world has moved on from this vision, the country from this reality. But Cuba is honoring a man who changed history. His ashes will now be taken in solemn procession across the country, retracing the victory march that marked the triumph of his revolution. Barbara Plett-Usher, BBC News, Havana.
The UN Security Council will hold an urgent meeting this afternoon to discuss the plight of thousands of Syrian civilians trapped by fierce fighting in Aleppo as government forces advance. France has warned that the world could be about to witness one of the biggest massacres since the Second World War. Our correspondent Thomas Morgan reports from Beirut.
Aleppo is a city on its knees. As the fighting goes on, civilians have again been caught in the crossfire. At least 21 have been killed this morning in one heavy aerial bombardment, women and children among them. Most of the images are too horrific to be broadcast. The French authorities say Aleppo could be the worst loss of civilian life since the Second World War. Those who can try and flee. Syrian forces and their allies are questioning those that leave. They say to try and weed out the rebels, those they call terrorists. Civilians that have reached pro-regime districts say they are angry with the way the rebels have dealt with them. But for the whole of Aleppo, the humanitarian situation worsens. Food aid, medical supplies are almost completely depleted. UNICEF say there are still 100,000 children living under siege in what was once Syria's largest city. Russia has criticised the West for not offering to help the residents who have fled the areas of Aleppo that were previously held by the rebels. Later today, the UN Security Council meets to discuss this crisis.
The vast majority of the people of eastern Aleppo are still trapped in a sharply worsening siege, pounded by accelerating bombardment, deliberately deprived of food and medical care. Many of them, including small children, report that they are simply waiting for death.
If President al-Assad continues to regain the parts of the city which were lost to him 4 years ago at such a rapid rate, it's difficult to see government forces agreeing to any immediate ceasefire. His aim is to reclaim the city by the time Donald Trump takes up office as a US president. But at this rate, it may be far sooner. Thomas Morgan, BBC News, Beirut.
In an exclusive interview with BBC News, the outgoing director of the CIA, John Brennan, has said it'll be disastrous if Donald Trump sticks to many of his current plans when he takes office. And Mr. Brennan warned the president-elect of the dangers of trusting the Russians. Our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera, is in Washington. Talk us through, Gordon, some of his main concerns.
Yes, it was a wide-ranging interview with the CIA director, looking really at what might come with the Trump administration, in a sense, from one of the most powerful national security officials, that he wasn't sure what was to come and how far, really, the Trump administration would match in policy what rhetoric it used during the campaign, especially on some of the most sensitive issues. The conversation we had began with Syria and events in Aleppo, and there he blamed Russia for much of the slaughter, as he put it, of civilians, and he warned President Trump and his team to be careful about dealing with the Russians, as they've talked about doing.
Russia is a country that will pursue its national interests, frequently to the detriment of the interests of the peoples of the countries wherein it operates. So I think President-elect Trump and the new administration need to be wary of Russian promises, Russian promises, in my mind, have not given us what it is that they have pledged.
As well as concerns over Russia, he raised the issues of Iran's nuclear deal and his concerns that the Trump administration might tear up that deal. Also concerns over how the new administration might employ the CIA's covert powers, issues of waterboarding causing great controversy in the past, and the use of language by some people associated with the Trump administration when it came to dealing with the terrorist threat. So a rather large number of concerns there from the CIA director and a rather large sense of uncertainty about what might be to come.
Gordon, thank you. Gordon Carrera there in Washington. Here, police say thousands of people are falling victim to a form of blackmail in which criminals trick people into performing sexual acts in front of a webcam and then demand money to stop the images being passed to other people. The number of victims of what's known as sextortion has doubled in the last year, as Danny Shaw reports.
A young victim of one of the fastest growing and most sinister scams on the internet. Daniel Perry from Dunfermline made an explicit recording on a webcam. He thought it was for a girl he'd met online. In fact, he'd been set up by criminals. They blackmailed him and Daniel killed himself. He was 17. Since Daniel's death in 2013, many more people have fallen victim to sextortion or webcam blackmail. Criminals threaten to share the explicit images with the victim's friends, family and colleagues unless they pay up. In the past year, police say 4 young men have taken their own lives.
The organised criminals that sit behind this are very clever in the groups, the way they target particular groups, the psychology they will use to get people to behave in that way. And I think people just don't realise this is the real world until that point where a demand comes in, and then I think their own world then starts to fall apart.
The National Crime Agency says sextortion cases have increased dramatically. So far this year, 864 incidents have been reported. Police say the true figure is in the thousands. Most victims are male and under 30, some as young as 11. And the criminals are usually based abroad in the Philippines, Ivory Coast and Morocco, though some operate from the UK.
Hey, how are you doing? I'm Jess. You're being recorded. Understand? You're being blackmailed.
Now a public awareness campaign has been launched. This video, which features actors, is designed to show how an apparently genuine online encounter can turn into blackmail.
Unless you pay.
Danny Shaw, BBC News.
Prince Harry has been visiting Barbados to mark the country's 50th anniversary of independence. During the trip, the Prince visited a children's home. At one stage, he had a joke tug-of-war with a 3-year-old boy who refused to let go of his toy octopus. He laughed and joked with the youngsters at the Nightingale Children's Village in the capital Bridgetown and told staff he would have loved to stay there all day. Now, a retired pensioner from Paynton in Devon became lonely and bored after his wife died 2 years ago and he missed his active life. So he placed an advert in his local paper. It said, "Senior citizen seeks employment. Still able to clean, do light gardening, DIY, anything. Save me from dying of boredom." Our correspondent John Kay has been to meet him.
Work wanted, senior citizen 89. Seeks employment in Paynton area.
Fed up with being alone, Joe Bartley wanted to get out and meet people. Widowed 2 years ago, he decided getting a job would be the best way to find company.
Save me from dying of boredom. When you walk into a flat, it's like walking into solitary confinement to me, like, you know. So I thought to myself, if I put an ad in the paper, seeking employment, old age pensioner, I'll see how it goes.
Joe served in the armed forces and then worked as a sign writer until he retired. So what kind of job is he after now? We checked a local website for vacancies.
Lorry driver? I can't drive. Okay. The last time I drove was in the 1940s and was an American Jeep.
Okay, let's not do that.
Have you ever driven a Jeep? It's lovely.
No, let's not do that.
Oh, you know, up and down.
Well, working as a waiter in a hotel?
No, because, I mean, I wouldn't fancy that. Too repetitious.
Mechanic?
No.
PE teacher.
Too old for that, exercises.
Cleaner.
Well, I could do that.
In fact, this afternoon there is good news. 2 months before his 90th birthday, a local cafe has asked Joe to come for an interview. And he quite fancies that.
I see different people coming in every day and that. Big smiles on their faces, I hope. Getting the bus to work, coming back and all that. And meeting workmates there and having a chat with them, like, you know, what did you do last night, you know, and things like that. Yes, I feel a new man, really.
Joe hopes his advert and the response to it will encourage other older people to get out and get busy. In the meantime, he's got a job interview to prepare for. John Kay, BBC News, Paignton in Devon.
Fantastic. Good luck to him. Let's catch up with the weather prospect, shall we? Chris Fawkes has joined me. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Jane. A freezing cold start to the morning, wasn't it? Yes, it was the kind of morning that will have put to the test the very woolliest of winter woolies. Frost on the ground, but for many, clear blue skies overhead. Now, it was a very, very cold night indeed. The coldest, actually, of the entire year across Wales and England. In Sennybridge in Powys, we got down to -10 last night. And in Benson in Oxfordshire, the new mark for the year, down at -9 Celsius. Where we've had that cold air in place, we've got clear blue skies, though, at the moment. The air originated from the Arctic, and that cold air arrived really on Monday. But it's not cold everywhere. It's not sunny everywhere, because to the north and west of the UK, our air is coming from a different source. It's coming in off the Atlantic. And with that, we've got these cloudier skies. It is also much milder. So if you look in western Scotland, this is where the highest temperatures are at the moment, up to 11 in Tiree. The Northern Isles having quite a windy afternoon with outbreaks of rain, but there will be a lot of dry weather elsewhere in Scotland. For Northern Ireland, the cloud will be prone to breaking, so a brighter day than we've seen over recent days. Still quite a bit of cloud coming in for northwest England, so that's a change compared with recent days. But the rest of England and Wales, really, it's sunshine like we've had for the last couple of days, but it feels cold. It feels more like the middle of winter rather than late autumn. Overnight tonight, the cloudy weather we've got for Northern Ireland, Scotland and moving into northern England, that will keep the frost at bay. So temperatures overnight around 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, something like that. But you can still see an area of blue on our charts, and this area of frost is still with us. The Arctic air still in place. And once again, overnight, southern Wales, southern counties of England, it's going to be a cold one. Not quite as cold as last night, but still -8. It's going to be a very, very cold start to the morning once again. Now, for Thursday, we've got our winds coming in more from a northwesterly direction. There will be a bit more cloud around generally across the UK, but the cloud's going to be quite thin, so it could well break. The best of any breaks probably across eastern and southern areas, maybe the southwest of England having the best of the weather, although there could be a few early morning fog patches here. By Friday, high pressure is still there, but we have a weak weather front coming in off the North Sea, and that will just introduce some thicker cloud into eastern Scotland, eastern England, perhaps with the odd splash of rain. But again, there could be a few breaks in the cloud, maybe towards the southwest, and you'll notice those temperatures getting a little bit closer to normal for the time of the year. That dry theme to the weather really continues on into the weekend. A lot of cloud around on Saturday. Sunday probably having the best of the cloud breaks and the sunshine, but all in all, it's looking like a pretty decent weekend. That's the weather, Jane.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. Thank you. And just a reminder of our main story here this lunchtime. More allegations have emerged of sexual abuse within football. The former Newcastle United player Derek Bell says he suffered abuse at his youth team in the 1970s. And that is all from the BBC News at 1. So it's goodbye from me, and on BBC One, we join the BBC's news teams wherever you are. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.